Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera, and today we will have an extremely important episode of interest to all our viewers. We will talk about immigration with a very prominent professor in Boston, Professor Ragini Shah. She is a professor and director of the Immigration Clinic at Suffolk University Law School Immigration Clinic. Professor Shah, it's an honor that you're here with us today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you so much for having me.
Professor, talk to us about the Suffolk University Law School Immigration Clinic. What is it?
Sure. So the clinic is a place where law students can act as attorneys, and they represent clients. In this case, in our clinic, the students are representing clients mostly who are facing deportation from the United States. And they could be facing deportation for a number of different reasons, either because they entered the country unlawfully or because, some of our clients actually have green cards, but are facing deportation because of a mistake that they made, maybe a criminal history that they have. And we try to help them remain in the U.S. And for some of them, that means applying for status for them to remain.
And are there any different kinds of status, or what are the different types? Sure.
So some of the different kinds of status that we've helped people apply for are green cards based on marriage to a U.S. citizen, for example. We've also helped people apply for asylum, which is for people who fear going back to their home countries. We've also helped people apply for something called special immigrant juvenile status, which is for young people who cannot live with one of their parents because of abuse, neglect, or abandonment by that parent. And then there's a number of other statuses like U visas, which are for victims of crimes. So we've represented people on a range of different statuses like that.
What are some of the challenges you face or issues that present while applying for status?
So I would say one big challenge is whether there's even a status available for the person. So that comes up in a lot of different ways. One way that it comes up is, for example, we've recently been doing a lot of advising of students at Suffolk, undergraduate students, law students, students who are in the country on student visas. And some of them want to stay in the United States, but they don't actually have a way of remaining in the US. And one of the reasons for that is there is a visa available for people to work, but it requires that an employer say that there's no one in the US who could do that job. And it also requires that the employer be willing to sponsor the student to be in that position. And so that's not always something that the employer is willing to do. And even if they were willing, it's hard in some industries to show that there's no one in the US willing to do that job. And so that means that there really isn't a status available. Other issues that come up, like particularly for our clients who are afraid to go back to their home countries, asylum is something that it is about fear, but you have to be afraid to go back based on a very particular reason. And so sometimes if people's reasons for being afraid don't fit into those categories, that can also be a challenge. And then the biggest challenge is if clients have any sort of criminal history, that can really stop people from being able to access a way to remain in the U.S.
Would take us to the steps for applying for asylum, for instance?
Sure. So the main thing that someone has to have in order to be eligible for asylum is a fear that somebody is going to persecute them. And so persecution has a really specific definition under the law. So it's not sort of fear of any kind of harm, but it requires that the person be afraid that they would face sort of personal harm, like they would be threatened or attacked in some way. In addition to that, in order to get asylum, the fear that you have can't be of just harm by anyone for any reason. So let's say somebody has been the victim of a really horrible crime. But if they weren't targeted because of their ethnic group or because of their religion or because of some other specific group that they were part of, then that's unfortunately not going to lead to a successful application for asylum. So, you know, asylum, while it is available as a form of protection for people who are afraid, does require a fairly high level of proof and a fairly complex argument about why the person is afraid to go back.
And Professor, so we don't go so deep into that, you also mentioned criminal aspects of deportation. Walk us through that.
Yeah, sure. So criminal issues can come up in two ways. So a lot of the people we represent are actually green card holders. They've been in the United States for, you know, sometimes as long as 30 or 40 years. But because they have been convicted of a crime, it makes them deportable from the United States. And so certain kinds of crimes a wide range of crimes actually will make people deportable. And so that's one of the challenges, is that it will put a person into deportation proceedings even though they already have status. And then another challenge is for people who are applying to stay in the U.S., if you have any sort of criminal history, even if you have a criminal history, like let's say you've been arrested and the charges were dismissed, that can still count against you in terms of being able to get a status like asylum, for example, or special immigrant juvenile status, or even a green card based on marriage to a U.S. citizen. So all of those kinds of statuses require the adjudicator to use what's called discretion, which means they're going to weigh the good and the bad. And so if someone has a recent conviction or a recent criminal charge for possession of a drug, for example, or shoplifting or something like that, that can really hurt somebody's chances of being able to get status.
So what are some of the deportable offense? What are some of the reasons that people with a green card can get deported?
So there's actually a really wide range of reasons. And you know, most commonly it's because of criminal convictions, but not necessarily criminal convictions that you would think of. Like, I think people think about crimes like rape and murder and, you know, very serious crimes that might get a green card holder deported. But the reality is that there's something called an aggravated felony, which does not have to be a felony, actually, and does not have to be aggravated. And so aggravated felony is really just a class of crimes. And it can include things like shoplifting, like possession with intent to distribute, simple assault, right? So somebody who gets into a fight at a bar or something like that. And those kinds of crimes, with the shoplifting and the assault, you have to have also gotten a 1-year sentence. But with those kinds of crimes, not only would a green card holder face deportation, but there would be no way for them to argue that they should be able to remain in the United States. So it's a really severe consequence for somebody who may have made that kind of a mistake a long time ago and have been in the U.S. for 20, 25 years after that mistake was made. But because of the way the law is written, they're not able to remain.
Now, you walked us through those criminal, I guess you were calling them in immigration aggravated felonies. However, in criminal law, they would be just misdemeanors. What makes them aggravated in immigration court or in immigration law?
So it's really just, there's a part of the law that defines what is an aggravated felony. So it's just a whole list of crimes. There's about 50 of them. And
the year sentence?
Well, so for some of them, it requires a year sentence, but other ones it doesn't. So if you're convicted of possession with intent to distribute, for example, it doesn't matter what sentence you got. If you are convicted of simple assault, then you do need to have gotten a 1-year sentence. If you're convicted of shoplifting, you would have to have gotten a 1-year sentence. But it's really just this list. So it does not require that the crime itself is a felony. It does not require that there's any aggravating circumstances, so it doesn't have to be an aggravated assault. It can be a simple one. So it's just this list of crimes.
And Professor, now you talk to us about the reasons for deportation. What are some of the defenses to deportation?
Sure. So the defenses to deportation, there are quite a few. For green card holders, there's something called cancellation of removal. But again, that's not available to people who are convicted of an aggravated felony. But for everyone else, immigration judge, cancellation of removal basically means the judge is going to weigh the good things versus the bad things in the case and kind of decide whether the person deserves a second chance to remain in the U.S. For everyone, asylum is available. There are some challenges if people have been in the country for a long time before they apply for asylum, but if they really are afraid to go back to their home country, that is one defense to deportation. Again, with all the caveats I said before, you have to be afraid for a particular reason. And then special immigrant juvenile status is available for young people. U visas available to victims of crimes. So there's a variety of different things available, but each one has its own requirements, sort of specific requirements. And so what I always say is that if somebody is facing removal from the United States, really it's very important to try to seek the advice of an immigration lawyer.
Now you mentioned the discretion of the judges. Is there a way where this is an automatic deportation rather than a discretion opinion from the judge?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like in the situations where somebody has a green card, right, and they've had a green card for years and years, if they are convicted of one of these crimes that counts as an aggravated felony, then that discretion is taken away from the judge. So for people who have those kinds of convictions, the judge won't even be able to weigh good and bad factors. And it won't matter how long ago the conviction was, and it won't matter how much of the green card holder's family is here or how old they were when they came to the country. We have had clients who've come into the United States when they were 2 years old. They did end up having a conviction for possession with intent to distribute, but they've been in the United States their whole life. Their entire family is here, and the judge didn't have any way of allowing them to stay. And so those are really difficult situations.
You talked to us about the reasons people get deported. What about the reasons that people can use to stay?
So again, some of the reasons that people might be able to stay is if they're afraid to go back. So that would be for people who qualify for asylum. There are other kinds of statuses like the special immigrant juvenile status, the U visa, et cetera. For green card holders, if they don't have a conviction for an aggravated felony, they would be able to stay if they're not deportable. But if they do face removal for some reason, they would be able to stay if the judge decides that all of the good things in their life history outweigh some of the mistakes that they've made.
And Professor, when people are facing immigration, is it mostly based on the judge's decision or based on the laws that are out there passed by Congress? How is the immigration court really ruled?
I would say it's ruled largely by the law because the law does have a lot of limitations to it. So there's only so much room for immigration judges to exercise their discretion. So largely it's ruled by the law. But then within the areas in which the judges have discretion, things do vary judge by judge. So there are some judges who will weigh factors like family ties and attempts to rehabilitate more strongly than other judges will. Other judges will weigh kind of criminal histories and what they would consider other bad actions, like maybe entering the country unlawfully and things like that, more heavily. So it really depends judge to judge once you get into that area of whether exercising discretion.
They're out there. There are attorneys that represent people facing, well, immigration attorneys, but there are also other kind of other professionals like notaries. And what is your opinion in seeking this advice?
So I would say for legal advice, I think it is really important to consult a lawyer. It is not, people who give legal advice who are not lawyers are doing something called unauthorized practice of law. And so that is against the law, actually. I also think there's a little bit of a danger for if somebody doesn't know the immigration law very well, it is a very complex area. And so people can make mistakes and get someone into trouble. And the consequence is going to be felt by the non-citizen, not by the notary or by whoever it is who's helping the person. And so that, I think, is something to really take into consideration, right? For people who are looking for assistance for their legal immigration issues, I would say there's consultations that are offered by the city of Boston. The mayor's office offers these consultations every other Wednesday. Those are good places to go because it's attorneys who are there. The Irish International Immigration Center, I always get that name wrong, also offers consultations. And so you can go on their website to find out when those are. And so that's just really important, is to get good advice, because there is a lot of, I think, fear in the immigrant community, and I think it's very easy to tell people what they want to hear, even if it's not true. And like I said, the ways to stay in the United States are pretty limited. And so if people are telling you something that sounds too good to be true, it's probably because it is.
So today, for our viewers, we have Professor Ragini Shah. She is a director of Suffolk University Law School Immigration Clinic. And this episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. Professor, what would you change about the immigration policy in America?
I would probably change a lot of things. I would say one of the main things, given the experience that we have in the clinic, is I would give discretion back to immigration judges. I would not take away their discretion to decide, for example, for people who've had green cards, for this whole class of people, taking away discretion from the judges to decide whether or not they should be able to remain in the country. So I would definitely get rid of that prohibition that judges can't look at cases where there's an aggravated felony conviction. I would also, we haven't really talked about detention, but a large number of people who get put in removal proceedings are also detained. And some subgroup of those people are subject to what's called mandatory detention, which means they cannot actually ask for a release from detention. So I would actually get rid of that as well. I think that once you've taken away somebody's liberty, it is extremely important that they be able to have a chance to have a hearing on whether or not they themselves should be subject to detention, and not be put in some big group of people, based on this class of crimes maybe that they've committed, saying that they can't be released from detention. Then I would also allow people to reunify with their families more easily. So right now there are some barriers to people, even people who are married to U.S. citizens, being able to remain in the United States and get status in the United States. And I think that's something that causes a lot of undue hardship, and actually probably causes people to remain in the U.S. unlawfully for longer than they would otherwise. And so if we could remove some of those barriers, we actually could probably reduce the number of people who are in unlawful status in the U.S. There's probably other things I would change as well, but I would say those are my main three.
Those sound amazingly interesting, Professor. I wanted to take you back a little bit to asylum. I understand that there are specific steps to attain it. Would you walk us through some of those requirements?
You mean like procedures to obtain it, or?
To obtain asylum in the United States.
So I think we talked a little bit about the substantive requirements already. So somebody has to show that they're afraid to go back. They also have to show that the reason that they're afraid is because of a particular group that they're part of, or a particular political opinion that they have. Basically, in order to show all of those things, a person is going to have to tell their story and tell it in a very detailed way. Usually it's good to have some evidence of, that what's happening to them or what they're afraid will happen to them has happened to other people in that country, so that there's some evidence that, this kind of thing does happen.
And Professor, what kind of evidence could show that?
So there's usually reports from human rights organizations that talk about the kinds of abuses that happen in particular countries. So the Department of State actually puts out a report every year on the human rights conditions in each country. There's groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that also write about what's going on, specific issues that are going on in different countries. And so if a person is afraid, let's say because their ethnic group is being targeted in a particular place, or because they're indigenous in a country where indigenous people are persecuted, then there's usually going to be some report out there from a human rights group that indicates that that is in fact something that's going on. And so you can document how common it is. And then sometimes it's useful to have an expert talk about either the mental health issues that the person has faced because of the trauma, or an expert to talk about maybe less common issues that arise in countries.
Very interesting, Professor. And now for the people who are victims of crime, for instance, I know you mentioned something. Would you walk us through some of those steps for them to attain asylum?
Sure. So for victims of crime, it's actually the visa that's available to them is called the U visa. And in addition to being the victim of a crime, you also have to be helpful to law enforcement. So a person, and you also have to be a victim of a particular kind of crime. So there's this list of crimes in the law that include things like domestic violence, stalking, involuntary servitude. And if someone has been a victim of one of those crimes, then if they report that to a law enforcement agency, and if they're helpful in the prosecution or the investigation of the crime, then that can help them obtain a U visa.
Now, there was a third category that I wanted to run by you. I think it was people who overstay their visa. Mm-hmm. What is a remedy for that? Would there be any defense?
So for people who overstay...
And what are the scenarios involved?
Yeah, so there are quite a few people, right, who might overstay their visa for different reasons. So it may be that somebody came in as a visitor, but they actually are afraid to go back to their home country. They didn't know what to do, so they just overstayed their visa and they're here. Now, in a situation like that, that might be somebody who might try to apply for asylum. There's also situations where people might overstay because they fall in love with a U.S. citizen, and so they're here. And so for those folks, there is the ability, if they marry this person that they fell in love with, they could remain in the U.S. Based on a marriage-based green card. I mean, it has to be a real marriage, but if the reason that they overstayed is because they fell in love with someone, then that's a possibility. But there really are not, so it's limited. It's limited the things that somebody in that situation could do.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a little bit less than a minute, but are there any last thoughts that you would like to share with us, or any comments about this policy or anything you feel like?
Sure. I would just say, again, for the people who are listening who are interested in getting legal help, it is really important to get that from a reputable place. And again, I think the mayor's office is a great place to get that assistance every other Wednesday. I think the other thing is to really think about, for those people who are not facing immigration issues themselves, hopefully this has been helpful in thinking about some of the issues that immigrants face that you may not necessarily think about.
Thank you, Professor Shah. And to all our viewers, today we have learned a lot about immigration from one of the most prominent figures in Boston, Director of Suffolk University Law School Immigration Clinic, Professor Ragini Shah. And this episode will be at www.discoveringthelaw.com. And thank you so much for your time today. My name is Lucy Rivera.